Good morning, 8th grade girls. Today we're going on to the next section in Social Studies, Chapter 10, Advances in Industry. And so last time we read about things like the steam engine and the steamboat being used and canals being built to allow transportation of goods to become more efficient, transportation of people to become more efficient. And so today we're going on to farm machinery. So we're on page 182, and we're going to start there. A new way to plow. The richest farmland lay under the thick prairie grass of the Midwest, but the soil was so matted with roots that iron plows often broke in the thick sod. Men could burn through the grass away, but they could not break up the soil. John Deere, a young blacksmith from Vermont, solved this problem. He began to experiment with a new metal called steel, which was stronger than iron. At one point, Deere could not even afford to buy the steel he needed for his experiments. He had to use old, discarded saw blades instead. But Deere displayed the hard work of a Yankee ingenuity, typical of the Puritan work ethic in New England, and his persistence paid off. In 1830s, John Deere patented the steel plow, a tool which kept its cutting edge as it plowed into the prairie sod. He designed the plow so that the thick soil rolled away and turned up a deep furrow for planting. Now, thousands of farmers from New England, joined by immigrants from Europe, began to flock the Midwest. Many farm tools and machines bear Deere's name today. I'm sure you've seen John Deere on tractors. It's usually green and yellow in color in its symbol. And so what that was it was a plow that had two handles, and it had kind of a blade like this, and as you pulled it through the ground kind of did this, which I'm sure you've seen them before, and it kind of brought it up and out and left a trench where they could plant seeds. And you need to till soil before you plant it to break up any roots and stuff, so that one, you can put seeds down, but two, that the new plants have the opportunity to grow their roots without having to struggle. So this was a really big invention for the farming industry in the Midwest. A new way to harvest. The prairie could produce an abundance of crops, but farmers needed more efficient ways to harvest their grain. Cyrus McCormick of Virginia met this need. As a young boy, Cyrus helped his father work on a machine that would reap grain. Their hard work was rewarded in 1831 when the 22-year-old Cyrus developed a reaping machine that made it easier to cut grain. By 1847, he began producing the machine in Chicago. Within 2 years, McCormick was a millionaire. He continued to develop new machines to increase farm output. Cyrus McCormick believed in being a wise steward of his money and gave millions of dollars to promote the gospel ministry of Dwight L. Moody in Chicago. And so a reaper, I'm sure you've heard of like the Grim Reaper from like around Halloween time or fantasy books, and it's this cloaked person who's holding a reaper or a scythe, which is like a long pole with a curved hook on the end, big long blade. And so the way that they would reap crops at that point was you would hold it, and it would have a handle here and a handle here, and you would just thrash or whack at the grain that you were cutting down, and it would cut it off, kind of like a weed whacker would, but it's all by hand. And you think hundreds and hundreds of acres worth of wheat and other grains, doing it this way, that's a lot of work, takes a lot of time. And so this reaping machine was huge. It slowed down, the process of harvest, or it made the process of harvesting more efficient. And there's a picture of the reaping machine up at the top of page 183. The family farm versus the plantation. America was still a nation of family farms. On a family farm, the land is owned by a family, and each family member does his share of the work. Private ownership of the land, 1, instilled a sense of healthy pride, and 2, desire to make a well-earned profit, And 3, assured the discipline and responsibility of every family member. The Bible was the most read book on the family farm, and Sunday was the Lord's Day, the day of family rest. Farm life was healthy and wholesome. Not one went hungry, and everyone had sufficient clothes. Even those who lived in towns, working in stores and factories, enjoyed close ties to the farms. In 1860, only 16% of American population lived in towns with populations over 8,000. Thus, more people remained close to the countryside. Small towns had no slums, and everyone had friends or relatives who lived or worked nearby farms. Indeed, many factory workers still worked on the farm when they were needed, especially during harvest. Most farmers in both North and South lived on family farms. However, some Southern families owned large commercial farms called plantations, on which they grew cash crops such as rice or cotton. In contrast to the family farm, where families did the work themselves, the plantation was operated by primarily slave labor. By 1850, the plantations and family farms of the South were among the most productive in the world. Southern plantations produced 7/8 of the world's cotton, and family farms of the South grew over half of the nation's corn, 1/3 of the nation's oats, and 1/4 of the wheat. The factory. Inventive New Englanders. New England's cold climate and rocky soil better suited the region for factories than farms. Yankee ingenuity soon found way to develop the region's abundant water power, and the Puritan work ethic provided ready workers for factories. In early 1800s, Francis Cabot Lowell improved the power loom for the rapid weaving of cotton cloth and harnessed the water power of nearby rivers to run his factories. In 1846, Elias Howe invented a much improved sewing machine that could be applied to both cloth and leather goods. After 1854, Elias Howe would draw over $4,000 a week in royalties from his invention. That's nearly $100,000 a day. So the power loom, if you've ever been to the Lowell Mills, this is another awesome thing that we have right in our backyards, is Lowell, Massachusetts, where this factory loom was patented and used. And so Lowell is known for its textile mills, or creating fabric. And so the Lowell Mills, you can go and visit today, and they have examples of what it looked like. Working conditions were really dangerous in the Lowell Mills, but the loom that he created, that Francis Cabot Lowell, the power loom, created, was really efficient for making fabric and allowed them to create a lot more at a much faster rate, which then could be shipped out to Europe, to the South, to the West, and so this became a booming industry for Lowell. The sewing machine, before sewing machines, you did it by hand or by a hand crank. And so the sewing machine, at this point, remember, we still don't really have electricity everywhere. So this is a pedal-powered sewing machine where you'd push on the pedal and it would turn the gears. And so this would not only sew through thick fabric, but leather, which is really hard. You need a heavy-duty sewing machine in order to do that. And so he started producing this in mass quantities. And of course, the mills, the factories making clothing needed something like this. And so down where it says he got $4,000 a week in royalties. Royalties is when you patent an invention and other people sell it for you, then you get a portion or a percentage of what it sells for. Not the 100%, because the company who is selling it gets some money, but a royalty, music is the same way. So if an artist's music is played on a radio or on Spotify or on YouTube, they get a royalty, or they get a payment for from the radio station or from Spotify for allowing them to use their song. And so that's what a royalty is. So once you've created the invention and patented it, now every time it sells, no matter who sells it, if it's sold legally, then you get a percentage of the money from that, which is pretty cool. So $100,000 a day in today's terms. That's pretty crazy amount of money for sewing machines. Our founding fathers provided a system of rewarding an individual for his inventiveness through patents or legal rights to his inventions. Thus, many people in the United States worked hard on new inventions, knowing that they would profit from the free enterprise system. By 1851, Isaac Merritt Singer would make further improvements on the sewing machine, and Singer would become a household name to millions. I'm sure if you've seen sewing machines, Singer is one of the name brands. I have a Singer sewing machine. Mining and steel. Many men working in steel and coal operations. Although the early machines and equipment were not as safe as those used today, new inventions were making factories and mines safer. The most important invention for the safety of coal miners was the miner's safety lamp, invented in 1815 by the English chemist and Christian Sir Humphrey Davy. Now, at the time, if you're digging for coal, you are in a cave that you have dug, and usually they would just carry lanterns, and if that lantern got knocked over or if the flame went out, then it was pitch black and quite dangerous. And so a miner's helmet was a hard helmet that kept their head safe, but also had a lamp affixed to the front so that they could work hands-free and still have a light. Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio became manufacturing centers for steel needed to build rails, engines, bridges, and other structures. Because the steam engine made it possible to power machines by means other than water power, the use of coal increased greatly. The coal and iron fields of Pennsylvania were especially valuable. More immigrants come to America. The growth of the factories created a market for new workers, and people came from all over Europe to find work in New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest. By the 1860s, over 1.5 million Irish had come to America, 1 million Germans, and many other Europeans. Many Irish came to escape the disastrous potato famine of 1840, a blight on the potato crop, the mainstay of the Irish diet, causing widespread starvation. The United States welcomed refugees, and soon they became the backbone of the railroad industry. Irishmen carried and laid most of the steel rails that linked the Northeast to the Midwest. Many Germans came to escape the political and social revolutions in Germany, where the writings of Karl Marx, the father of communism, brought suffering and violence. And we're just going to go back and read the box at the bottom, Christian Influences on Industry. While it is true that early factories required hard work and long hours, they supplied a much-needed and profitable work for many in the Northeast. The new factories also provided a higher standard of living for many Americans. As his factories in Waltham and Lowell, Massachusetts, Francis Cabot Lowell provided clean housing, healthful food, schooling, and wholesome recreation for his employees. Lowell established what is called the Lowell system of manufacturing. He brought the efficiency and virtue of the Protestant work ethic to the factory system through his concern for the spiritual and physical health of his employees. A descendant of the original Puritan settlers in New England, Lowell carried on the Puritan tradition of godly behavior at work and in the home. Francis Lowell employed mostly young women in the mills. The work was hard, but not dangerous. No one was allowed to drink alcoholic beverages, and workers attended church. After working an average of 5 years in the mills, most of the women left to marry or start a family. At the factory, sisters and cousins often worked and lived together, for Lowell wanted to keep family ties strong. Some of the women who worked in the mills wrote and published a monthly magazine, The Lowell Offering. It included passages of scripture which encouraged good behavior. One of the workers who contributed to the Lowell Offering, Lucy Larcom, became a rather well-known poet. She wrote that she worked hard in the factory in order to advance herself. The wages were generous for the time and schooling was provided. She wrote, Many Lowell girls continue their education and become primary and grammar school teachers. Some assume positions in the community while others return to their homes. Some of the women built fine homes with their earnings. Those who held more temporary employment lived in modest but clean boarding houses. The famous English novelist Charles Dickens cast a critical eye on the factory life in general, but when he visited Lowell's mills, he wrote, "They, the workers, were all well dressed. They were healthy in appearance, and many of them remarkably so, and had the manners and deportment of a young woman. The rooms in which they worked were all well ordered as themselves." Francis Lowell believed that Christian principles could be applied to the modern age of industrialism, bringing the benefits to the employer and the employee. So although it says that the Lowell mills were not dangerous, there definitely were aspects that were dangerous for mills. A lot of times children would work in the mills as the need for, as we go along in history, there became needs for poorer regions of America to send their children to work in factories. And the factories were very large machines that were powered. They didn't have an off switch. And so if you got your hair caught in a loom or your clothing, or your hand, then it could cause a lot of damage. A lot of girls died this way or were very badly injured through the machines. I'm sure as a percentage, the percentage of those who were hurt compared to those who weren't is much lower, but there definitely were dangers when it came to working in the mills. It was also very, very loud in the Lowell mills. If you've ever been to the museum, they give you kind of a sound check to feel what it would have felt like to work in one of the loom rooms or the weaving rooms, and it's extremely loud, which did a lot of ear damage for the girls working there. And also the loom, because it's using cotton fabric or cotton thread, as you're weaving with cotton thread and the machine is, banging and moving around that thread, it's causing dust and lint into the air. And you think of hundreds of machines per room being run at the same time. That's a lot of lint in the air, or cotton fibers that are floating through the air that the girls are breathing in. And so that did create a lot of lung damage for a lot of the girls that worked there. And so there were risks in working in the Lowell mills. Wonderful that it was set up to be such an organized and respectful organization and did allow schooling for girls, which was not widespread at this time. But it also came with its challenges. So check-up questions on page 186. Things to answer in your packets. 1, what was so hard about farming in the Midwest before the steel plow? And who invented the steel plow? When? Who invented the reaping machine? What did he do with a big portion of his earnings? What is the family farm? And what is the most read book on the family farm? What's the most important invention for the safety of coal miners? And who invented it? And when? Name 3 states that became manufacturing centers for steel. What brought many Irish and Germans to America by the 1860s? Talk about both. So what was going on in Ireland that caused them to come, and what was going on in Germany that caused them to come, and what industries did they go into typically? What were living conditions like for workers in the Lowell system? And then a few things to identify. Francis Lowell, the power loom, patent, Elias Howe, and Isaac Singer. Next time, we're going to go on to start reading Better Communications, and we're going to talk about Morse code and the telegraph, the transatlantic cable, and all kinds of things to now open up communication. Now that manufacturing lines are more efficient, now we're going to get into communication.